The amphitheater on Nexus Prime had seen better days, though considering it was built to showcase the galaxy's most efficient killers for the entertainment of beings who thought violence was beneath them, better was a relative term. The arena stretched across 17 hectares of imported crystalline sand from the outer rim, its walls rising 300 meters into the artificial atmosphere that kept spectators comfortable while contestants fought for their lives below. It was, the promotional materials claimed, the pinnacle of civilized entertainment, a statement that would have been hilarious if it weren't so tragically accurate. Ezra Whitmore stood in the preparation chamber, examining the energy barrier that separated him from certain death, with the same casual interest most people reserved for checking their reflection. The barrier hummed with enough power to vaporize a small moon, yet here he was, tapping it with his knuckle like he was testing a microphone. The sound it made was disappointingly ordinary, a dull thunk that suggested the galaxy's most advanced technology had all the acoustic properties of cheap plastic. Fascinating, he muttered, though whether he was referring to the barrier or the fact that he'd somehow ended up here was unclear. 3 days ago, he'd been installing atmospheric processors on a mining station in the Helix Nebula. Now he was apparently the evening's entertainment for several thousand beings who considered humans roughly equivalent to particularly clever houseplants. The selection process had been, according to the official documentation, entirely random. Ezra had his doubts about that. Random systems didn't typically pick maintenance workers who happened to have spent their formative years in the outer colonies, where the definition of customer service included knowing 17 different ways to kill someone with a Hydra spanner. But then again, the galaxy's bureaucrats weren't known for their attention to detail, particularly when it came to the care and feeding of their pet species. Outside the barrier, the arena's preparation crew scurried about with the efficiency of insects preparing for a mating flight. The crew consisted primarily of Nixari's 6-limbed beings who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet and given the result an MBA. They moved with the kind of purposeful urgency that suggested they were either very professional or very afraid of their employers. Probably both. The head technician, a Nexari whose carapace bore the scars of someone who'd learned their trade through experience rather than textbooks, approached the barrier with what might have been sympathy. It was hard to tell with species that communicated primarily through clicking sounds and antenna positions. The probability matrices indicate your survival chances at approximately 0.003%, the technician announced, its voice carrying the mechanical precision of a universal translator, doing its best with the language that consisted largely of aggressive clicking. This is considered statistically equivalent to impossible. Ezra nodded thoughtfully. And what are the odds of the betting pools having factored in human behavioral patterns? The technician's antennae twitched, in what the translation software interpreted as confusion. Humans do not possess behavioral patterns relevant to combat scenarios. Your species lacks natural weapons, armor, or significant predatory instincts. You are classified as adorably harmless by the Galactic Species Registry. Adorably harmless, Ezra repeated, savoring the words. The registry had clearly never met a human who'd spent 15 years keeping mining equipment operational in environments where everything from the air to the rocks was actively trying to kill you. That's a new one. Enishi. Above them, the arena's massive screens flickered to life, displaying statistics that would have been depressing if they weren't so absurd. Ezra's vital signs appeared alongside his combat rating, a number so low it was practically theoretical. The crowd's betting patterns scrolled past in real time, showing odds that suggested most spectators were wagering on how quickly he'd expire rather than whether he'd survive. The truly remarkable thing about galactic civilization, Ezra reflected, was how thoroughly they'd convinced themselves that intelligence was inversely proportional to physical capability. The Nexari were brilliant engineers, but had all the combat effectiveness of particularly aggressive accountants. The Vorthak were living weapons, but couldn't operate a coffee machine without detailed instructions. And humans? Well, humans were the adorable pets who fixed things when they broke and occasionally provided comic relief. It was a worldview that had served the galaxy well for millennia, creating a stable hierarchy where everyone knew their place, and violence was safely contained within entertainment venues like this one. The system worked because it was based on a simple truth. Predators were obviously dangerous, prey were obviously harmless, and the distinction was as clear as the difference between a Vorthak's fangs and a human's lack thereof. The arena's announcement system crackled to life, filling the air with the kind of bombastic music that suggested someone had fed a symphony orchestra nothing but sugar and caffeine for a week. The crowd's anticipation was palpable. 17,000 beings from across the galaxy, all gathered to watch what they assumed would be a brief and entertaining demonstration of natural selection in action. Ladies, gentlemen, and distributed consciousness entities, the announcer's voice boomed across the arena, tonight's exhibition features a rare specimen from the Terran Preserve, a genuine human in pristine condition. The crowd's enthusiasm was the sort reserved for particularly cute animal videos. Ezra could practically hear the collective awe rippling through the stands as his image appeared on the screens. The betting displays updated in real time, showing odds that suggested most spectators were treating this as a charity event rather than a legitimate contest. From somewhere in the arena's depths came a sound that made the air itself seem to recoil, a roar that carried 30 million years of evolutionary refinement in the art of inspiring terror. It was the sound of something that had never questioned its position at the top of the food chain, something that viewed the universe as a vast buffet arranged specifically for its convenience. Grimjaw was warming up. The preparation chamber's walls seemed to shrink as that roar echoed through the complex, a sound so primal and effective that even the Nexari technicians clicked nervously. It was the kind of roar that bypassed the rational mind entirely, speaking directly to the hindbrain's ancient understanding of predator and prey. Ezra finished examining the energy barrier and turned toward the arena entrance, where the real show was about to begin. The crowd was practically vibrating with excitement, their betting patterns shifting as they debated the finer points of creative dismemberment. The arena's systems hummed with readiness, sensors and cameras positioned to capture every moment of what promised to be a brief but memorable spectacle. What none of them had bothered to consider was the possibility that 30 million years of evolution might have given humans something more interesting than opposable thumbs and the ability to fix broken machinery. The barrier began to lower, and Ezra stepped forward into the arena, where the galaxy's most feared predator waited to demonstrate why fear was such a useful emotion. The crowd held its breath in anticipation. They had no idea what they were about to witness. The betting pools had achieved something that physicists once thought impossible. They'd created a mathematical expression for absolute certainty. The odds against Ezra surviving the next 15 minutes had reached numbers that required scientific notation to display properly, while the side bets on most creative demise and will the human cry before expiring were generating more interest than some planetary economies. In the premium viewing boxes, where the galaxy's elite sipped imported beverages and pretended their entertainment choices weren't deeply questionable, the conversation had turned to the fine art of wagering on what was, essentially, a public execution with better lighting. "I've put 50,000 credits on dismemberment within 30 seconds, announced Councillor Vextol, whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a jellyfish and a tax attorney. The human's vital signs suggest it's already experiencing pre-death terror responses. His companion, a crystalline entity that looked like someone had taught a chandelier to think, chimed in harmonics that translated as smug satisfaction. Such optimism. "I've wagered on death by intimidation before physical contact. These mammals are notoriously fragile when confronted with actual predators." Down in the arena, the object of their financial speculation was conducting what appeared to be a casual inspection of his surroundings. Ezra moved with the methodical precision of someone checking a repair manual, examining the sand's composition, testing the acoustics by clapping his hands, and generally behaving as if he'd been asked to provide a maintenance assessment rather than participate in mortal combat. The crowd found this behavior charmingly naive. Here was a creature so thoroughly removed from the realities of survival that it was treating a death match like a workplace inspection. It was almost endearing, in the way that watching small animals attempt tasks beyond their comprehension could be entertaining. What they failed to recognize was that Ezra's inspection was actually a comprehensive threat assessment disguised as curiosity. The arena's sound was imported, which meant it hadn't been properly tested for thermal conductivity. The walls were reinforced quantum steel, but the support struts showed stress patterns that suggested weak points at predictable intervals. The acoustic properties he'd tested revealed that the arena's design created specific resonance frequencies that could be exploited under the right circumstances. The preparation protocol called for combatants to receive basic equipment suited to their species' natural abilities. For a Vorthak, this meant minimal armor that wouldn't interfere with their natural weaponry. For a human, it meant a standard-issue emergency suit that was basically a glorified jumpsuit with life support capabilities. The equipment allocation system has provided you with standard defensive gear, announced the arena's AI, its voice carrying the bland efficiency of a customer service representative. Please note that modifications or creative usage of provided equipment is discouraged and may result in penalty points. Ezra examined the suit with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. It was designed for protection against environmental hazards rather than combat, which made sense given that humans weren't expected to engage in combat. The suit's designers had clearly assumed that any human ending up in an arena was either there by mistake or as part of some elaborate cosmic joke. They weren't entirely wrong about the cosmic joke part. The suit's environmental systems were surprisingly sophisticated, including atmospheric processors, temperature regulation, and emergency medical systems. What the designers hadn't anticipated was that a human with 15 years of experience maintaining complex machinery in hostile environments might view these systems as components in a larger toolkit, rather than simple life support. The arena's preparation chamber included a basic fabrication unit, ostensibly for last-minute equipment adjustments, but actually present because the arena's designers believed in providing condemned beings with the illusion of agency. Most species used it to sharpen claws or adjust armor straps. Ezra used it to manufacture what appeared to be a simple tool belt. A human is engaging in grooming behavior, observed the arena's lead commentator, a Nexari who'd built a career on providing play-by-play analysis of systematic violence. This is consistent with species-typical stress responses. Note the repetitive, purposeless actions. The crowd murmured in appreciation of this insight. It was always fascinating to observe how different species faced their final moments. Some raged against the inevitable, others accepted their fate with dignity, and apparently humans engaged in what looked like getting ready for a shift at the factory. The betting pools updated again, with new categories appearing. Will the human attempt to negotiate? How many seconds before involuntary biological functions? And, the crowd favorite, will it try to befriend the Vorthak? In the VIP sections, the academic observers were taking notes for their research into interspecies behavioral patterns. Professor Yilketh, whose 17 doctoral degrees made her the galaxy's foremost expert on xenopsychology, was particularly interested in what she was witnessing. Fascinating, she murmured into her recording device. The human appears to be engaging in ritualistic preparation behavior. This may represent a previously unobserved death ritual among the species. A research assistant, an eager young Nexari named Chickfax, clicked enthusiastically. Should we alert the xenoanthropology department? This could be significant for our understanding of human cultural practices. Indeed. Make a note that human death rituals appear to involve what can only be described as fiddling with equipment and looking around thoughtfully. Most illuminating. The arena's environmental systems were performing their final checks, ensuring optimal conditions for the upcoming spectacle. The sand was at the perfect temperature, the atmosphere was properly balanced, and the lighting was calibrated to provide maximum visibility for the recording equipment. Everything was ready for what promised to be a brief but memorable demonstration of natural selection in action. What none of the observers, commentators, or betting pools had considered was that humans had spent roughly 300,000 years developing a very specific set of skills. They weren't natural weapons like the Vorthak's claws and fangs. They weren't natural armor like the crystalline entity's hardened shells. They weren't even natural camouflage like the Nexari's adaptive carapace. Instead, humans had developed something far more dangerous: the ability to look at any situation and immediately begin figuring out how to break it. The arena's announcement system crackled to life again, signaling the final phase of the preparation period. The crowd's excitement reached fever pitch as the moment of truth approached. Bets were locked in, recording devices were activated, and 17,000 beings prepared to witness what they assumed would be a brief but entertaining reminder of why the galaxy's natural order existed. In the depths of the arena complex, something that had never questioned its position as the ultimate predator was growing impatient. Grimjaw's roars were becoming more frequent, more aggressive, more filled with the kind of primal hunger that had made the Vorthak the most feared species in known space. The crowd could feel it building, that delicious anticipation that came from watching forces beyond their comprehension prepare to collide. It was the same feeling their ancestors must have experienced when watching natural disasters from a safe distance, that mixture of terror and fascination that made civilization possible. Ezra finished his preparations and stood quietly in the center of the arena, hands empty, posture relaxed, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a transit shuttle rather than facing imminent death. The crowd found this touching. Such innocent trust in the face of overwhelming odds. The betting pools closed with a final surge of activity. The odds against human survival had reached astronomical proportions, while the side bets on the manner of death had become so creative they bordered on artistic. Nobody had bothered to bet on what would happen if the human won. After all, that would have been mathematically impossible. The arena's floor shuddered as the primary containment barrier began to rise, revealing the entrance to what the promotional materials euphemistically called the Challenger's Gate. The crowd's excitement peaked as the first glimpse of movement appeared in the shadows beyond. Something vast and predatory that moved with the fluid grace of a nightmare made manifest. Grimjaw emerged into the arena's artificial daylight like a force of nature that had decided to take physical form just to prove a point. The creature stood nearly 4 meters tall, its midnight black carapace reflecting the arena's lights in ways that suggested it had been designed by someone who understood that true terror was as much about aesthetics as lethality. 6 limbs ended in claws that could have doubled as industrial cutting tools, while its head, if the term applied to something that looked like a cross between a mantis and a fever dream, bore mandibles capable of shearing through battle armor. The Vorthak had evolved on a world where everything larger than a pebble was actively trying to kill everything else, and 30 million years of selective pressure had produced something that made other apex predators look like enthusiastic amateurs. Grimjaw was the current champion of the arena circuit, holder of 47 consecutive victories and the undisputed master of converting living beings into abstract art installations. The crowd's roar of approval was deafening, 17,000 beings expressing their appreciation for millions of years of evolutionary refinement dedicated to the art of creative dismemberment. The betting pools had already closed, but the energy in the arena was palpable as spectators prepared to witness what they assumed would be a brief but memorable demonstration of natural selection. Grimjaw surveyed the arena with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through aggressive application of violence. The creature's movements were fluid poetry written in the language of controlled lethality, each step calculated to maximize intimidation while positioning for optimal striking angles. Then those compound eyes fixed on the small figure standing calmly in the center of the arena. The roar that followed was something that transcended mere sound. It was a primal declaration of dominance that carried the weight of evolutionary authority, a sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the cellular memory of what it meant to be prey. The arena's acoustic systems, designed to handle the vocalizations of the galaxy's most aggressive species, strained to process the sheer volume and complexity of the sound. In the stands, beings who had never known fear in their civilized lives found themselves experiencing something their ancestors had felt when the universe was younger and hungrier. The crystalline entities resonated in harmonic sympathy. The Nexari clicked nervously and adjusted their carapaces. Even the supposedly emotionless AIs running the arena's systems registered what their programmers had optimistically labeled concern protocols. It was the kind of roar that should have reduced any rational being to a quivering mass of terror and involuntary biological functions. It was the sound of absolute predatory authority announcing its presence to anything foolish enough to challenge it. Ezra looked up from examining his fingernails and met Grimjaw's gaze. The effect was immediate and profound. The roar cut off as if someone had thrown a switch, leaving the arena in a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Grimjaw's massive form went absolutely still, compound eyes locked onto the human, with an expression that the arena's behavioral analysis systems struggled to categorize. The crowd's excitement faltered as they processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to proceed. The human should have been cowering or screaming, or at the very least showing some recognition of the overwhelming death machine bearing down on it. Instead, Ezra stood there with the relaxed posture of someone waiting for a particularly boring meeting to start. "Interesting," Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "You're bigger than the specifications indicated." The comment was delivered with the tone of someone noting a minor discrepancy in a technical manual. No fear, no awe, no recognition of the 47 previous beings who had died in this arena trying to face down the same predator. Just a casual observation about size parameters. Grimjaw's head tilted slightly, the mandibles clicking in what behavioral experts would later describe as confusion. In 4 years of arena competition, the Vortak had encountered rage, terror, desperation, and various forms of pre-death hysteria. It had never encountered complete indifference. The crowd began to murmur uneasily. This wasn't following the script. Where was the fear? Where was the desperate last-minute scrambling? Where was the entertainment value they'd paid to witness? The human appears to be experiencing some form of shock-induced paralysis, the arena's commentator announced, though his voice carried less confidence than usual. This is a documented response to overwhelming predatory stimuli, but the behavioral analysis systems were telling a different story. Ezra's vital signs were steady, his stress hormones were within normal ranges, and his posture suggested alertness rather than terror. The human wasn't frozen with fear, he was simply waiting. Professor Yilketh frantically adjusted her recording equipment, her 17 doctoral degrees, providing no framework for what she was observing. "This is unprecedented," she whispered to her assistant. "The human is displaying no fear response whatsoever. It's as if it doesn't recognize the threat." Her assistant's antennae twitched nervously. "Perhaps its nervous system is too primitive to process the danger." "No," the professor replied slowly. "Look at the micro-expressions. The human is analyzing the situation. It's studying the Vorthak like a specimen." In the arena, the standoff continued. Grimjaw took a step forward, claws scoring deep furrows in the crystalline sand. The movement was designed to trigger flight responses in any creature with functional survival instincts. The human didn't move. Instead, Ezra cocked his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've worked with industrial equipment that made more impressive sounds." The comment hit the arena like a physical blow. The crowd's murmur turned into something approaching panic as they tried to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't fear or shock or any recognized response to predatory intimidation. This was dismissal. Grimjaw's massive form trembled, not with rage, but with something no Vorthak had ever experienced before. For the first time in its existence, the ultimate predator was encountering something that didn't recognize its authority. The human was looking at 47 consecutive victories, millions of years of evolutionary refinement, and the galaxy's most feared killing machine, and finding it merely adequate. The betting pool's displays flickered as the arena's systems struggled to process odds that were rapidly becoming meaningless. The crowd's excitement had transformed into something approaching existential confusion. This wasn't how the natural order worked. Predators intimidated prey. Prey responded with appropriate terror. The universe had rules, and this human was apparently unaware of them. Ezra took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the motionless Vortark. The movement was casual, unhurried, the kind of step someone might take when crossing a room to examine an interesting piece of machinery. "I suppose we should get started," he said, as if suggesting they begin a routine maintenance procedure. The arena's silence deepened, becoming something that seemed to press against the walls themselves. 17,000 beings held their breath, waiting for the explosion of violence that would restore the natural order and provide the entertainment they'd paid to witness. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Grimjaw took a step backward. The crowd's confusion reached critical mass as they watched the galaxy's most feared predator retreat from a being that could have been mistaken for a particularly clever houseplant. The arena's systems registered the movement, cameras tracking the subtle shift in positioning that transformed Predator into something far less certain of its position in the cosmic hierarchy. Ezra continued his approach, hands still empty, posture still relaxed, looking for all the world like someone conducting a routine inspection. The human's complete lack of fear was having an effect that millions of years of Earth-like evolution had never prepared Grimjaw to handle. For the first time in its existence, the ultimate predator was discovering what it felt like to be uncertain. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their entertainment transformed into something far more unsettling than simple violence. They were witnessing the moment when the galaxy's carefully constructed hierarchy began to crack. revealing something underneath that none of them had bothered to consider. The music had stopped, and nobody knew what came next. The silence stretched until it became something almost tangible, a presence that filled the arena like a held breath. Grimjaw continued its retreat, compound eyes locked on the human who had apparently decided that the galaxy's most feared predator was mildly interesting at best. Ezra stopped walking and tilted his head again, studying the massive creature with the focused attention of someone evaluating a particularly complex piece of machinery. "You know what's fascinating about intimidation displays?" he said, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute quiet. "They only work if both parties agree on who's supposed to be afraid." The crowd's confusion had evolved into something approaching panic. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about the natural order. Predators dominated through fear. Prey responded with appropriate terror. The universe had spent millions of years perfecting this system, and now some maintenance worker from the galactic backwater was treating it like a minor scheduling conflict. Grimjaw's mandibles clicked frantically, the sound echoing off the arena walls like castanets played by someone having a nervous breakdown. The creature's massive form trembled with something that behavioral analysis systems couldn't categorize, because Vorthak's psychology had never needed a classification for existential uncertainty. "The human appears to be malfunctioning," the arena's commentator announced, though his voice carried all the confidence of someone reading a manual for equipment that had just caught fire. "This behavior is not consistent with documented mammalian responses to predatory stimuli." Professor Yul Keith had stopped taking notes entirely, her 17 doctoral degrees providing no framework for what she was witnessing. The human wasn't just unafraid. He was projecting something that made her primal hindbrain whisper warnings about creatures that hunted in the dark spaces between stars. Ezra took another step forward, and Grimjaw retreated again. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but the arena's sensors caught it and broadcast it to 17,000 beings who suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about the cosmic hierarchy. "Here's the thing about humans," Ezra continued, his tone conversational as if he were explaining a simple technical procedure. "We're not predators in the traditional sense. We don't have claws or fangs or impressive roaring abilities, but we do have something far more useful." He paused, looking directly at Grimjaw with eyes that seemed to see through the creature's millions of years of evolutionary refinement to something far more fundamental. "We're persistence hunters. We don't kill our prey quickly, we just follow it until it dies of exhaustion. We can run for days, we can track for weeks. We can outlast anything the universe throws at us, and we will pursue our target across continents, across solar systems, across the entire galaxy if necessary." The crowd's murmur had died completely. Even the arena's environmental system seemed to be holding their breath. "The really interesting part," Ezra continued, "is that we developed this hunting strategy while being hunted ourselves. Every predator on our world tried to kill us, so we learned to kill them back. All of them. Every single species that thought humans looked like easy prey discovered that we were actually something far more dangerous. Something that would remember their faces and hunt them down one by one until their entire species was extinct." Grimjaw's retreat had become obvious now, the creature backing toward the arena's wall with movements that suggested it was beginning to understand that it might have made a terrible mistake. "So when you roar at me," Ezra said, closing the distance with each word, "all I hear is another predator announcing its location. And when you show me your claws and fangs, all I see is another set of tools that will be buried with their owner after the hunt is finished." The human stopped just outside striking distance, hands still empty, posture still relaxed, but something had changed in the arena's atmosphere, a subtle shift that made the air itself seem heavier, more dangerous. "The choice is yours," Ezra said quietly. "You can leave now, or you can discover why humans are the only species that turned warfare into an art form." Grimjaw stood motionless for a moment that seemed to last forever. Then, with movements that carried the weight of evolutionary wisdom, the galaxy's most feared predator turned and walked toward the arena's exit. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their entertainment transformed into education. The betting pool's displays flickered and died, their algorithms unable to process odds that had become meaningless. The arena's officials scrambled to understand what had just happened, their carefully constructed hierarchy crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Ezra watched the Vorthok disappear into the depths of the arena complex, then turned and walked toward his own exit with the same casual stride he'd used to enter. The crowd parted before him like water, beings who had considered humans adorable pets, suddenly understanding that they'd been keeping apex predators as maintenance workers. The galaxy's entertainment had revealed a truth that would ripple across civilized space for generations to come. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't need to roar. After all, when you're at the top of the food chain, everyone else already knows. Within 48 hours, the footage from Nexus Prime had spread across every inhabited system in the galaxy. Not the official broadcast, that had been mysteriously corrupted by what administrators claimed was a technical malfunction, but amateur recordings from spectators who'd witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. The Galactic Species Registry found itself inundated with requests for human reclassification. The adorably harmless designation was quietly retired, replaced with a notation that simply read, "under review," in 17 different languages. Academic institutions across the galaxy suddenly discovered that their xenobiology textbooks were woefully inadequate. Mining stations reported a curious phenomenon. Their human maintenance staff had begun receiving considerably more respectful treatment from supervisors, who'd watched the arena footage with growing unease. Interstellar shipping companies noted that cargo manifests listing humans as harmless biological specimens were being hastily amended. The arena on Nexus Prime suspended operations indefinitely, citing fundamental reconceptualization of entertainment parameters. Grimjaw was offered early retirement with full benefits, which the former champion accepted with what observers described as visible relief. Ezra Whitmore returned to his job installing atmospheric processors, though his new employment contract included significantly improved working conditions and a salary that reflected his employer's newfound appreciation for proper human care and feeding. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions, though whether they'd learned it well enough to avoid future misunderstandings remained to be seen. After all, humans were full of surprises.